All right, we've got folks rolling in on the noon session today. Please feel free to introduce yourself and let us know where you're from. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for being here. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. I see people still rolling in on the attendee list. So make yourselves at home and we'll be right back with you. All right, great to have everybody today. As you type your name in and let us know where you're from, Equitable, North Carolina wants to welcome you today to our noon session. A couple things that we want to do on the housekeeping side is let you know that we have closed captioning available in real time. So hit that button down there at the bottom of your toolbar. If you need that assistance, we're also recording this and it's going over YouTube live as well. We're going to start our conference, our noon session today, the Building Equitable Engagement into Transportation Project session. I'm going to introduce Kim Roney. She's going to be our moderator and host for this session, and want to remind folks that we were going to try to use our chat feature today. So at any time during the presentation, feel free to type your questions in. And we'll do our best to get to as many as possible before the session. And of course, the moderators and panelists will be able to see those questions and follow up with you as well. Be also on the lookout for information in our chat box for bios and contacts information for our panel today. So without further ado, as folks roll in, Kim, would you like to go ahead and start us off?
Sure thing. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2020 North Carolina Bike Walk Summit panel on building equitable engagement into transportation projects. My name is Kim Roney and I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel today. Please read the bios dropped in the chat for these brilliant panelists and follow the chat for links and more information so you can continue the conversation and join in the work. We'll pull questions from the audience as time allows, so drop those in the chat as well. This hour is going to go quickly, so we're going to jump right into the convo with this first question. What is the history of transportation decision-making and outcomes that equitable engagement aims to address? Hannah, do you want to start with a broad historical overview describing how the status quo has yielded inequities?
Absolutely, and I'd love to start with just some really brief audience engagement. Could folks type into the chat if you've heard of the term redlining? And I'll be sure to define it. All right, great. We've got some folks already. So redlining was the institutionalized and the systematic practice of government working with realtors and banks to segregate communities of color into undesirable areas. They literally drew red lines around folks of color and denied them loans to buy homes or open businesses. And these redlined areas were deliberately located next to polluting industries. They were isolated from good transportation options, which has led to this disproportionate air pollution and the growing racial wealth gap in communities of color and particularly in Black communities. And I think it's easy to kind of think of that like, oh, well, that's a thing of the past, right? That's not the case at all, right? It's so important to recognize that America's transportation planning and decision-making process is still centered around, racism, white supremacy, and capitalism. Low-income communities of color continue to be shut out of the transportation planning and decision-making process. They continue to be prescribed transportation options that often don't meet their mobility needs. And just, I would say that community engagement today, it's not accessible to everyone because the form it generally takes enables the loudest, generally the whitest voices in the room to be heard because they have the time, ability, access, privilege to show up at public meetings, advocate for their needs, and navigate the really complex participation process. And so that's why we need these equitable engagement to reverse those decades of injustice.
Thank you so much. Can we hear some examples from Chicago, Obai?
Sure. Thank you very much. I got a few examples I want to share. However, I don't want to take the entire time of this panel, so I'm going to share one. And this is a recent example. It happened about 3 years ago. The city of Chicago implemented its Vision Zero Chicago plan, a plan to reduce traffic violence in the city and in neighborhoods. And in that plan, there was a priority on police enforcement. The plan listed high crash areas and high crash corridors. Nearly all of them were in predominantly Black and or brown, low to moderate income neighborhoods. Immediately, myself and others advocated against a police enforcement strategy, given the Chicago Police Department is racist, abusive, and corrupt. And this was probably months or so after the video of Laquan McDonald being murdered. It was also shortly after the US DOJ under the Obama administration had investigated CPD and found rampant corruption and abuse throughout CPD. Our advocacy work, we did go and meet with the mayor's office. We learned in that process that there was hardly any ownership of Vision Zero at the neighborhood level. The steering committee was mostly made up of City of Chicago agencies and hardly any Black and brown people involved in that steering committee, and practically no Black and brown people engaged in crafting that plan. In our advocacy work and working with the mayor's office to remove enforcement, at one point they committed to us that they would not execute an enforcement strategy until we held a Vision Zero summit that was neighborhood based. Within a few weeks, we went to a steering committee meeting, and the Chicago Police Department reported publicly that they were executing enforcement on high crash corridors. So this is what happens when there's no equitable engagement. Our neighborhoods potentially are harmed by these policies, these practices, and these processes. This is why equitable engagement is critical in our cities and in our neighborhoods.
Thank you so much, Obai. I wanted to say thank you because that work reached the mountains of Western North Carolina as we were considering our own Vision Zero policy on my service in Asheville's Multimodal Transportation Commission. So it carried, and I'm thankful. Example of this maybe from Durham, Ideal?
I want to share a map here. So thank you, John, for prompting this, but I wanted to share my screen, and this is a redlining map of actual Durham, North Carolina. And you can see through the spine of it, that is where our freeway lands. I don't know if you can see my little hand mouse here. I live right about here in this corridor. And I can assure you that all the red areas in there, if you visit those communities, that's where all the asphalt and cement plants are. That's where all of the large scrap yards are, electrical disposal. And that is cause for concern because of the actual, like Hannah mentioned earlier, the overwhelming impact that pollutants have in those communities. And what we know is that there were very low home prices in those areas. And there's also an issue with the fact that there's not as much connection to infrastructure for safe walking and biking. This area of Durham here in the red area, the chunky part of the red at the bottom, is known as having the highest rate of walking and pedestrianism in the city. And yet, I haven't compared the crash data, but I know that in a lot of these red colored corridors, there's a lot of crash data that tells us that this is also a place where a disproportionate share of injuries are, with the exception of around Duke University, which has a higher concentration of students that are walking and biking in those tight quarters as well. Another thing I wanted to share for y'all here, let me get to my screen, is the photos of the Hayti community before 147, which is the Durham Freeway, came through. So 147 is the name of the highway that came through shortly after redlining was instilled as the practice of the banks. And then eventually there were, obviously we know, funds that were released to create these massive highways that almost always were magnetized and attracted to destroying Black communities. And so this is a picture of Hayti as a large scale community on the left, Pettigrew Street. I live off of this street here. And so what you see is hundreds and hundreds of homes. And what a lot of people don't know is that this was known as a bastion for Black communities to feel economically empowered and safe. These are the descendants of people who left the Stagville plantation after emancipation, and they went on to establish their own businesses in their own homes. These are people who owned outright their homes and businesses and were able to squirrel away a little bit of money and send their children off to college. Therefore, Durham became the place that has almost, I believe it still holds this honor to this day, the highest number of Black PhDs per capita. And so that's the power of being able to have your own community. So imagine how devastating it is. And you fast forward to 1972, and this is what the area roughly present day looks like. There's a few new developments in the area, but the only real architectural sort of location left that's original is the Hayti Heritage Center, which was St. Joseph's Church. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is that there were people who resisted. So this is a community, Crest Street, that decided to buck up against what was happening. And they did manage to preserve their community because the freeway took about 20 years to build. This didn't happen overnight. And so I just wanted to be clear here that the freeway doesn't in one night, right, take away affect 4,000 families and 500 businesses. We're talking about 4,000 families that were displaced and 500 businesses. So Crest Street saw this coming, saw this federally funded killing off of their community, and decided to fight back, and were able to almost completely preserve their community by moving the freeway slightly over. So I want to say that about the Crest Street community and bring it up here in this talk, because I want to make sure y'all know that those of us on this panel stand on the shoulders of people like this, that we're not talking about a new thing. We're talking about a thing that does work, engagement of people and community standing up in an organized fashion, that there is a history of that folks don't just roll over and go away. Obviously, some efforts are more successful than others, but that's just one example here in Durham of the tragedy and also the triumph around engagement, the triumph of engagement, but the tragedy of federal policy to have injured this community so much that to this day it hasn't yet quite recovered.
Thank you for bringing forth these powerful stories about infrastructural racism and these specific examples. Do we have anything else that comes up in your mind before we move on to the next question? Okay. So our second question, what does equitable engagement in transportation mean for you? And how does it show up in your work? Can we start with Laura?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Laura Biediger, and I work with the City of Durham as an equitable community engagement strategist in neighborhood improvement services. So I'm coming at this from a local government municipality lens. One of the first things I'll say is that I think about equitable community engagement, full stop. Like, not just for transportation, not just for planning or community development, it's equitable community engagement, because a key piece of it is working together and working with communities holistically. If you have transportation problems, you probably also may have issues with accessing healthy food, finding daycare, affordable daycare for your family or for a senior, finding masks right now to ride transportation. Just people don't live just one light or have just one thing that they work on. There are lots of things. So in the city, we've been working a lot on trying to bring our engagement efforts together instead of talk to us to transportation at this meeting, at planning at this meeting, and so on. That requires a lot of resources, as Hannah said. That ends up being then the people with the most resources are able to take all of the surveys and attend all of the meetings and be represented in all of those spaces. And if you're someone that's already with limited resources in neighborhoods like Ideal was talking about, that's just too much. So that's one thing that I'll say is that we think about equitable community engagement and what other engagement efforts are going on in the city, from the city as a government, but also in the community that we can work with, and in that piece of meeting people where they are. In the city, we developed an equitable community engagement blueprint about 2 years ago. I think that will be shared in our resources for this panel. Please take a look at it. It has a lot of questions that we developed in concert with community members like Ideal to really set forth a vision of when the city is doing engagement, how they really need to be thoughtful about the engagement that we're doing, to be clear with community members and transparent about where people can actually have influence in a project, understanding the communities that we're working with, like Ideal is talking about, understanding who we're trying to reach, what their current situations may be, so that we can try to begin in at least a more compassionate position, who we can partner with in that area, who are the trusted leaders that maybe can help us to reach other people. Because especially as a white city employee, but as a city employee in general, when I go into a community, I represent 147 and I represent a lot of harm that has come to these communities. I may have not been alive for that. I may have not been here or part of that, but I am representing an institution that has really harmed in the past and even today, even with things like if you think about the PPI or different things that have come out through CARES and how different, especially Black and brown businesses have been disproportionately affected. Stuff still happens. I'm a government employee, they see that. So it's really important to partner with people like Ideal who can help us to understand more of where community members are on this and how we can have conversations with them in a direct and effective way. One of the other pieces I would say is that it's also really important to resource the community members that we're working with. So in the past, the city has often relied on engagement consultants for large transportation efforts, and that means spending our dollars and investing resources outside of the city, often for firms outside of the city to tell us locally how to engage people like Ideal and her neighbors. And then they'll come to Ideal and ask to pick her brain because she knows how to talk to her neighbors, and she's not getting any kind of compensation for that. It's often poorly executed, and our engagement isn't very high. And then a relationship isn't built overall, because engagement is about trust and relationships. So in the past 2 years, we've been working really hard to try to shift more of the money that we would normally spend on consulting efforts like that to contracting with local community groups and local leaders to help us so that they can design and lead their own engagement. Because again, you know best how to engage your community members. And then that's keeping those efforts and that investment local. And it's helping to, I think, to slowly build a little bit of the trust and relationships that we need, so that when people come out and talk about these issues, it feels meaningful and they feel seen and it is authentic.
Thank you, Laura. Ovayi, would you like to speak to this question next?
Sure. So what does equitable community engagement look like in transportation? There's a few things that are critically important for us when we think about equitable engagement. One is that racial equity, mobility justice is fully operationalized in a city, within an agency, within a mainstream white-led advocacy organization, prior to even attempting to do equitable community engagement. There must be racial equity, mobility justice operationalized within these institutions. And it must be policied. We do not believe that we leave a commitment to racial equity in the hands of well-meaning people. Well-meaning people come and go. This commitment must be policied and ideally legislated. Number two is that the ownership of the planning process must rest in the neighborhoods and communities of those who are the most harmed, the most impacted by inequities. Should there be a focus on racial equity, the ownership should be with Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. Should there be a focus on disability inequities, then it should be the ownership should be in the disability community. Should the focus be on poor people, then it should be the people who are low to moderate income within these within cities. The ownership must come from the people who are harmed the most. And within that, it also means white people need to move out the way, shift power, ensure you're empowering Black and Brown people to sit at those tables, be respected, and have a voice in how things move forward. Number three, at the start of a project, a policy, a process, or what have you, there must be some analysis of the inequities. We must understand the severity of the problem. How bad is it? Who's impacted? What complexities exist? What are the subtleties that we may not know about through only quantitative analysis? There must be some qualitative analysis as well. So there needs to be a robust process to understand the problem through a data analysis, through quantitative and qualitative analysis. Number four, the process of crafting a plan, the process of building out what we are going to do to address the inequities must be collaborative. And again, it must be led by the people who are experiencing the most inequities. Where we need agencies and cities and mainstream white-led organizations is to bring your expertise to the table when we call for it, not to be in a leadership position. You have some expertise, you have some technical expertise that we will need. We will call you when that time is right. The leadership needs to come from us. Number five, be explicit about the outcomes you seek. What do you want to achieve with this process, with this project, with this new investment? What do you want to achieve? What equitable outcomes do you want to see come to fruition for marginalized people? Be explicit and be public about it. And then number six, there must be a public evaluation and accountability for agencies and cities who are executing this work, so that we are able to determine, did you hit the outcomes you set out to achieve? Did we hit the outcomes that we set out to achieve? And then the final step, number seven, is community power to explore that data analysis of that evaluation. And when we're not hitting those outcomes, the community is empowered to come in and adjust the project, adjust the policy, adjust the plan to ensure that the plan does begin to meet the expectations as originally intended. So that's just a quick overview of how we think about equitable engagement. And I'll just say as a closing note, anyone who's doing this work and it's easy or comfortable, you're not doing this work.
Thank you so much. Ideal, can you speak next to this question, please?
Yeah, I would love to. So thank you. I'm so glad that Ubai went first, because in Durham we have an evolving story, and I appreciate his putting policy up front and talking about like the well-meaning intentions. People come and go from these positions. Leadership at different community groups shifts, and it's really important to have what I call codified language about what it is that you want to be in place for time to come to express the values. And so in Durham, we have, as Laura mentioned, the Equitable Community Engagement Blueprint. And that was a really robust process between local community groups, active residents who've been in these conversations. And those rooms looked really different than most meetings around planning and transportation. So those conversations and those things all popped off because a really big conversation about a trail system came through the city. And, a lot of people in the inner circles of open space and trails work knew all about this large kind of plan to connect all the trails in Durham and create what is referred to as a great loop. And I just was like, I can't believe that, as nosy as I am as a resident, that I had no idea this was coming. And I just asked a really innocent question and fell down a rabbit hole that then instigated a whole set of conversations in community about how are we expressing the future development of Durham. And I want to say something to everybody on this, in this conference at Bike Walk NC. I've attended several Bike Walk NC events in the past. And I think that there is this very naive assumption that sidewalk, bike lane, or trail or open space infrastructure is innocent and agnostic. It is absolutely not. As I like to say out in community, trails ain't innocent. They have been one of the largest galvanizing forces to increase property values along the corridors. And so again, much like Obai said, if you don't have an explicit plan for how you're going to stabilize a community, dropping all these amenities into communities these days is nothing but a lightning rod for increasing prices for not just residential, but also commercial spaces around there, therefore limiting who can actually access these beautiful resources. So when Bike Walk NC and other groups show up into meetings naively expressing support for specific amenities in communities without having had an equitable engagement process that helps you understand the nuances, that it's not that Black and brown people don't like bike lanes, it's that we want a plan for how we don't get pushed out of our neighborhood when they arrive. It's not that we don't like trails. Hell, we are the founders of one of the biggest trail systems that was never funded. It's called the Underground Railroad. You don't walk across 5 state lines because you didn't train for it or think that it was going to save your life. But federally funded trails, i.e. Trail of Tears, we all know that can bring destruction and genocide to people. So we cannot act like trails and cute biking paths are innocent. They have implications. And so all we're saying is listen to us so that you may learn what those implications are. So in Durham, so that's my rant. In Durham, we decided to do this equitable engagement blueprint, and it was a knockdown, drag out sort of discussion, sometimes very tense, about the systems of how public involvement is currently done. And what we learned is that, as Laura said, we outsource engagement to people who don't know the community. For those of you who work at firms and are on this panel, here's what happens. Y'all call me, an unpaid, unfunded person on the ground, and you ask for my Rolodex. And you ask to drop into the meetings I curate, and you expect to do that for free, $99. And guess what? It ain't happening in Durham. So in Durham, what we're doing is that it's not that we don't have the money in your cities, whether it's Asheville all the way to the coast, Manio to Murphy. There is no city that doesn't have money already for engagement. You're just spending it on the wrong people because you think those fancy letters are going to get you those community members. Well, guess what? Fancy letters don't get community members out to a meeting, especially not in the middle of a pandemic. Relationships. You wish you had my phone tree. You wish you had my email list. And guess what? These days it's for a fee. And not because I'm trying to be mean, but because when I see my neighbors shelling out their own money to host a monthly birthday party for all the kids who can't afford their own, right? When I think about Bonita or Constance, who I know are on this panel as participants listening in, about all the work that they so lovingly pour out into their respective communities, I just think that that deserves something. And obviously it's not about paying people as employees so much as it is offering a gesture of support for community capacity. Because for every hour that they don't have to fundraise for those birthday parties or fundraise for the printing costs to go door to door and leave off flyers with the elderly, is time that they can invest into having wonderful dialogue about the very specific things that you need. And the stories that you get out of that in trusted containers with trusting relationships is going to be far richer data than your cute little survey is going to get, where it's 90% white males making over $60,000 who fill out that survey. That's not Durham. It's never going to be Durham. So let's go ahead and, you know, it's not that we don't have the resources, but we need to utilize the resources in ways that actually make sense. So in Durham, that's what we're doing. We're choosing to say it's not okay to spend 40 grand on 4 meetings that yield 12 community conversation, like 12 people from the community that will actually give you their opinion on a particular bike project. That's insane. A community group with 40 grand will work you a miracle. You won't even know until you try it. And so we decided, as Laura said, to have small grants, $10,000 to like $50,000 per community group. And that's nothing compared to what some of these consultants are getting paid. That's nothing. That's a drop in the bucket. But you can cover a whole community with a whole city, a county with 6 or 7 well-placed groups that already have a Rolodex, already have trust in the community.
Thank you all. I've been in way too many panels where there's not enough time for community questions because the moderator just felt like they had to plow through a list. And acknowledging that we all agreed to the third question, I just want to take a minute and make sure that if you saw something popping up right now and were inspired, would you like to lift it up right now? Okay, let's hear from question 3. What are your challenges in doing this work? Oh boy, can you lead this conversation to start?
Sure. I want to just say thank you to Ideal and Laura. And my friend Deborah Franklin asked me a question about funding. So first, completely agree with Laura and Ideal that Black and Brown people must be compensated for our work with cities and agencies. And the organizations that we lead must be compensated for that work. And then the other piece around funding, first, I encourage everyone to look at our Equiticity Racial Equity Statement of Principle, which is available on our website, equiticity.org. It's in draft form. However, that will allow you to clearly understand how we frame up racial equity. And one of the principles in our Equiticity Racial Equity Statement of Principle is the fair, just distribution of resources. Going back to this idea that we don't leave this work to well-meaning people, what that means is that the way we distribute resources in our city must be mathematical. It must be formulaic. It must be directional. There should be a formula, a mathematical formula based on the analysis, based on the inequities, based on the injustices, which determine how resources are distributed in our city. Look, there's some fiscal crises out here. Our cities have funding. What we must do is to redirect the funding to those who need the funding the most. That is the foundation of racial equity. That is what racial equity is. At its core, it is an economic system. It's not a value system. It's an economic system. It's an operational system. Okay, some of the challenges that we face. Racism. Structural racism is the root cause of all injustice experienced by Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Privilege, arrogance, coming from white people who are convinced somehow that they know what's best for Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, and they're clueless, and their fight against the car, their righteous indignation, their support for clean air and active forms of transportation makes them completely blind to the harms that they're doing in our neighborhoods. And this idea that racial equity or mobility justice is just a concept that anybody could express a commitment to is harmful for ensuring that we're seeing some real outcomes. We're seeing some real positive impact on Black and brown neighborhoods. Those terms have been co-opted. They are rarely understood. They're rarely executed against in an operational way. And this allows anybody to express a commitment to it because so few people understand it in a deep, sincere, authentic way. So yeah, those are just some of the challenges. I'll turn it over to some other panelists.
I would love to jump in on the funding question because I think it's also just one of our larger challenges. But first, I just love to quickly touch on the challenge of equity washing, right? So much talk, so much lip service, not much action. And I truly feel like our funding structures reflect that most. So, I mean, really, if we're going to talk about equity, then our transportation funding structures have to reflect that. And right now, we just know that they're not even anywhere close. And to get there, we need kind of guiding equity principles. And so we recently published a greenlined economy report, which outlines 6 standards for equitable investment. So every single investment, and particularly transportation investments, should first emphasize anti-racist solutions, prioritize funds to those that need it most, exactly as was just mentioned. Second, prioritize multi-sector approaches because folks don't just need transportation access, they need economic opportunities, they need health outcomes. Investments must also deliver intentional direct benefits, not this trickle-down approach to communities, going directly to communities. They need to decide for themselves how they want to spend those funds. Fourth, funds need to help build community capacity because for so long, folks have been so disinvested in that it can be really challenging to even have the capacity or the technical assistance to even win these competitive funding opportunities or to develop what is a community-driven transportation equity plan. Fifth, funds have to be community-driven at every single stage by lifting up community ideas and decision-making. And then last, investments have to establish paths towards wealth building and not just like, cost savings and jobs, which are important, but we also need community ownership of assets and opportunities to continue building wealth. And so these 6 standards are for equitable investment is how we're evaluating the equity outcomes of different clean transportation programs and funding streams in order to improve and expand upon them.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
So I've been involved for the last 4 or 5 months in the implementation of a shared streets program, otherwise known in other parts of the state or country as slow streets. And by and large, I feel really good about that, except that some of the challenges, that I noticed is that there's not always agreement or an understanding that what you're as an agency, like a transportation department or a private firm, when you're working with a community-rooted person, you need to understand that if you are not clear about the information that you're giving them that they pass on to community, that you could literally eat up the trust that they've built up over the years. And so the carelessness with the commodity of trust is something that I have often felt very frustrated by in my dealings with larger firms that can withstand, quite frankly, the fact that they may have misspoken or are not thinking about in a 360 degree the relationships that you are trying to attend to when you're in a community. So for instance, if I'm trying to share with the community the options that they really have within a particular timeline, a particular budget from an engineering standpoint, you need to make those options as crystal clear, accurate as possible. Because if I shop those options to a community and then in the 9th inning, you tell me, well, actually, that part of town can't have a traffic circle because there's gravel on both sides of the roads and we need to pave that portion. And I don't know that until 2 days before our build day. You have just shot me in the foot. I have to do some very serious negotiating at that point. And too often at a certain altitude, people do not see they don't see the trees in the forest at that point, and they don't understand that is damaging to community. And it is why some community members don't want to work with large agencies, because those agencies, whether they're government departments or private firms, those folks do not value the very thing you've centered your entire life around, which is community relationships. And so they literally, even if you're paying them, they can't afford to waste their community reputation on folks who do not respect the value of that in their everyday life. So that's been a challenge for me that I know I've had to face and deal with. And also just the challenge of people not understanding time. There are certain things that I can do a lot faster than other agencies because I already have the Rolodex. But what a lot of people don't always understand is that integrating and contextualizing your work into the larger community story is something that takes intention and diligence, and that we actually have to have a conversation around. So you can't just send me your PDF summary of a few things and then be like, okay, and we're out. Like, no. We need context about what came before this contract or this engagement and what is to come after, so that you see, and agencies and government departments need to see their work as part of a larger community story. And stories and storytelling has the power to really help make sense of a lot of complicated things happening all at once. We all know that we don't do projects in a city all separately and neatly apart. They're all kind of happening in weird timelines, and that can be a little difficult sometimes to help communicate the story in a way that is digestible by the community and that becomes part of their sort of like biographical understanding of their community and city life. And value for storytelling is just not something I find to be very high within government settings. And that's a tragedy for me. So I'll leave it at that.
So the third question was, what are your challenges in doing this work? And we've also spoken a little bit to funding, when the community should have a policy or plan. Laura, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I will talk especially to the challenges. Ideal talked some about this, but I think time is definitely one of the biggest ones. The speed at which the community may move on an issue and the speed at which the city moves on an issue are almost like always opposite. Like when a community is ready for something, they're ready for sidewalks. They're ready for sidewalks yesterday, a year, a decade ago. The city process to get sidewalks is much longer. And then when the city they're ready to talk with the community about sidewalks, or they're ready to talk to the community about something like that. Like Ideal was saying, that involves prep. That involves like laying a foundation and having a discussion, introducing these concepts, like laying out expectations on what can and can't be done. But the city wants the feedback yesterday or in the next month. And to really really engage residents that probably haven't been heard or taken the online survey, that takes time. And so I think those two, in that way, those two pieces of time, but also the time in relationships and just talking to people. Again, this is all just back to having relationships and respecting the community. There are no shortcuts to that. We recently held a public participation training that some city staff and community members came to. It was only like 3.5 hours. That was a big chunk of time. Actually, Benita and Constance that are on today, I think, participated, as well as Ideal. And one of the takeaways that a staff member said to me was they were kind of looking for they didn't say the shortcut, but basically a shortcut to relationship building. And that doesn't exist. And I know Ideal's talked about this, and I've been with other community members. They know when you're not being real. They know when you're just there because you need to get that engagement, that feedback so that they can take it to city council in a month. They know that you're just there. They can tell when you're there just to check a box because they've already laid out what the project is going to be. And this is the last step before they have to go to city council to get this approved, and then they can put out the bid. So that piece of like, it takes time, and it takes time when you're not working on the project. It takes time long before you've thought about a project. It takes time just to get to know people and understand them and understand their transportation issues, but also the schools that their kids attend and their other things that are going on in their lives, so that you can hear as transportation issues come up, and then you're able to help respond and advocate when we actually have funding to do some of these projects. And the piece on funding I've talked about a little bit. Again, in the city, we have been able to work with, especially our transportation department. Our new transportation director is very supportive of supporting community members to do engagement and really gets this vision, which is really amazing. So he has provided funding through our funding with Go Durham and Go Triangle, if I have that correct, for community members. And our department, Neighborhood Improvement Services, currently has an RFP out for our to recruit local community partners. But one of those issues in funding is how the city works and the capacity that has been established in the community. The city works through RFPs and a contract and bidding process that also is very inequitable and all kinds of barriers. And then within the community, we haven't normally funded this kind of work. So a lot of the really amazing community members I work with that have been doing community organizing and have the Rolodexes like Ideal's talking about for 40 years, don't have bank accounts for their organizations because the city's never offered funding like that. So now we're really excited because we can see the work that they do and we want to fund them, but that infrastructure isn't there yet. So this piece of trying to figure out how we can help to support that work without having to also create a bunch of nonprofits and put too much work on community members, but still be able to fund them. That's a challenge that we're working on now. I think that's one of those things, slowly building how we can break down some city processes to be more accommodating, as well as helping to put together that community infrastructure. I think that's something that feels more obtainable, but that's also definitely a challenge.
I wanted to sort of say something about challenges, like the current methodology for like getting community input usually heavily leans on these very sort of centralized like meetings that are run by people you don't know, don't care about, don't have relationships with, don't understand, and they don't know you. They're just it's kind of like a mass marketed meeting, like 4 or 5 meetings, and then like online surveys. And so I wanted to share something really quickly so that y'all could get an idea of the proof in the pudding, because I know that we're sitting here telling you all these challenges and we hope you'll turn the corner, and you're hearing all these challenges like, oh God, like, should I even get into this? So this is a little summary from the Engage Durham website. So it is public information. And basically the gist of this is, from the first round of engagement, there were 3 different strategies that were done. There were workshops, there were online surveys, and then there were engagement ambassadors. And engagement ambassadors were made up of mostly grassroots people who already have connections to neighborhood folks. And so here's what's interesting in terms of who was engaged in the process, right? In the workshops, you see that the majority, 68% of these folks, are white folks. In the survey, 70% of respondents are white folks. And with the engagement ambassadors, 84% of these folks are people of, are of Black descent. So like, in terms of like proof in the pudding, right? Gender identity, there wasn't much difference between folks. In age, here's another surprising thing. Y'all, our 15 to 24-year-olds really showed up. Do you know that, young people roughly are about a quarter of our city's population? So this much more matches the actual presence within the overall county's demographics to have this ambassador style. And what I mean by engagement ambassadors are grassroots folks who are provided a small stipend, for the privilege of them presenting content to their network and receiving feedback. And we support them with documents and all the necessary tools, and we talk about what they need, and then they go from there. Here's another surprising one: level of education. A quarter of the engagement ambassadors are at the high school level, 13% at less than a high school level. Check out what happens with workshops and surveys. Most of the respondents are graduates with an advanced degree. So we're not even just talking about college graduates with bachelors. Not much difference with LGBTQIA population. They were better in representation with households with disabilities. And the zip codes much more heavily in the 27704 and 03 zip codes, which are heavily Black and brown communities. If you remember the map of Durham, the freeway kind of runs through here. This large chunk down here was the large redlined area. So you'll notice that most of our engagement ambassadors came from redlined communities. So that's just something of note. And so I just wanted to like drop that in there to explain that like the closer to the ground you get in terms of relationships, the more likely you are to be actually able to reach the people that everyone says is so hard to reach. Folks are these typical sort of attributes, you know, like income or lower education or whatever. Those folks are often seen as hard to reach, but their lives are very easy to connect to when you just tell the truth about why it is that you can't connect to these folks. You can't connect to them because you don't have a personal or political will to do it. Full stop. There is no other reason. There's no other reason. Because if you want to survey people who are low income, sit your behind on the bus or sit your behind at the DSS office. You're going to meet a lot of people. It's real simple. Go to court. In the lobby of the courthouse, you'll meet a lot of people. They're waiting on, you know, their appointments for hours at a time. They have nothing else to do. Captured audience. So there was a question about how the engagement ambassadors do their engagement. They were pre-pandemic, they were allowed to gather their own meetings. So they could either like meet at the park or in their home, or they maybe were already running a meeting and we're going to flip one of their meetings specifically for the purposes of the comprehensive plan. Now I'm helping to run this next batch of engagement. And because of the pandemic, we're creating all virtual tools so that people can do it on Zoom, Google Meet, Facebook Live, however they want to do it, so they can conduct a presentation safely online and have people submit their feedback online, like through a survey as they're being engaged through the conversation.
I'd love to really quickly jump in with another challenge, but also a solution. So I think a challenge is that mobility options are so often prescribed instead of giving the self-determination to communities of color to decide for themselves, you know, what works best for them. Maybe it is a bike, maybe it is a sidewalk, but we also have to be open-minded that folks may just prefer taking the bus, and we can't come in with like our preconceived plans and priorities. And so I want to share another resource, which I'll drop into the chat, which is Greenlining's Mobility Equity Framework, which essentially is a tool to prioritize equity and community engagement, but in a way that really flips traditional transportation planning and decision-making on its head. The framework's 3 steps are centered around a community mobility needs assessment, an equity analysis, and the community ultimately votes on which mobility options they want deployed. This is largely based on a participatory budgeting process, if folks are familiar, but it's tailored to a transportation context. And so in San Francisco, they contracted with community-based organizations to hold workshops where 150 residents were paid to co-design and brainstorm mobility options that would make their community more equitable. They then compared the 90 ideas from the residents using equity indicators and metrics that reflected the community's priorities. And these equity indicators are intersectional. We can't just be measuring transportation equity, but also health equity, climate equity, economic equity. And then based on the top scoring project proposals, the community voted on which options to fund and implement. And so this is really a way of democratizing transportation planning and decision-making processes and prioritizing folks of color in the process. And it has now been implemented in Seattle, San Diego, Portland, as well as to several state of California grant programs.
All right, how are our levels? Do we feel like we got to address the challenges that are on the top of our minds? Okay, so we have a handful of community questions in just a few minutes. So one that came up is, can you all speak to how to plan for and advocate for adequate time to do proper equitable engagement, especially for projects on a more aggressive timeline? I'll let y'all take the lead on who's going to take this first.
There's no easy way to say this, and like the reality is that folks need to know how to say, like, how to accept a community's request for slow or no, to like slow down, or no, we don't want this at all. And that's the first thing I ask anyone who wants to contract or partner with me is, okay, I'm gonna get in the pocket with my community members, and if the sum total of people's sentiments are slow or no, can you hear that? Can you submit to that? And that's not an easy thing to do, but what I do promise people is that if it's slow or no, and that's a politically hard thing for them to take back to whoever up the chain, that we'll have their back, that will be a cover, an explanation, that it won't just be pettiness being offered as a rationale for why that is. It's never pettiness, but it is a question of priorities. And so that's the best I can say to it. It's often the case that, you know, you hear people say, oh, well, we have this deadline, and then we have to get really creative and realize that there's actually more space in the timeline than you care to admit sometimes. But the linear thinking of like predominantly white cultured spaces can sometimes play like there isn't as much time as there really is for certain things. Investing time in certain processes actually does help you gain time in other places, is my belief.
I'd also say that sometimes timelines are a policy issue. And so in California, there is an expenditure deadline of funds, and that really creates these huge barriers to doing quality engagement and implementation. And so for us, we're realizing that like we now need a legislative fix for that, because as long as, you know, cities do want to extend that, they're just not able to.
And the other thing I would say is always be engaging. Like, a timeline doesn't need to just be about when your project begins. We've talked a lot about projects, but really engagement should be community-based. So you should always be in the community, always aware of what, you know, which communities are having issues with sidewalks, which of those are state roads. And so we need to be like ready when the state's talking about this, we need to be ready, because we already know we're having these regular conversations with Merrick Moore or with Bragtown, and we know what's going on in these communities and what's foremost for them. So that when we have the opportunities for funding at state and federal levels, or as our budget year is coming up, like we know what's going on. And I also think part of that is, again, partnering with all the other things that the city or the county or other communities are doing in engagement wise. The data that Ideal was sharing was from the first phase of Durham's comprehensive plan. So there were, I don't know, over 1,000 people that were engaged in that process, and they gathered a lot of information. It was 2 open-ended questions, from thoughts on engagement to transportation to job, workforce development and things like that. And so even if for city projects that are starting now, I send them to that source to look and see, has the community already said a lot about your issue? Because you don't need to go and start a conversation just fresh and think like, oh, it's going to take me forever. Now my timeline's really long. The city is already having conversations, and you need to know what those, what has been voiced and what those priorities are, and use that as a starting point to go back and see like, oh, I see that these are really big issues. How can we kind of use this and build off of that for our engagement?
2 things come to mind for me. One is that racial equity, mobility justice must be operationalized in these agencies and cities that are executing these aggressive timelines. When it's, something just happened here. When it's operationalized and when it's policied, that's the best defense against these outrageous timelines, asking our communities to move at their speed. And then the second thing is that oftentimes the folks who are executing these timelines are consultants. And these consulting firms need to say no. You want to do business with the city, you want to engage our neighborhoods, you all need to say with a collaborative voice, with a collective voice, especially those consulting firms that express a commitment to racial equity and these justice